My name is Captain Molly Ball. I'm 35 years old, and I've survived combat zones in Iraq. But nothing could have prepared me for the sight on my own front porch. My parents, both in their 70s, stood shivering outside my front door, their lips blue from the cold. While inside, my in-laws were hosting a lavish dinner party filled with strangers. My father, a Vietnam veteran, had a trembling hand placed over the long scar on his chest from his heart surgery, while my mother tried to stay steady on feet ravaged by arthritis. What happened next changed everything for all of us. Before I continue, let me know where you're watching from. Please support me by liking this video and subscribing to my channel to hear how I made sure they would never hurt my family again. To understand the cold cruelty of that night, you need to understand that it didn't start with a locked door. Contempt rarely does. It starts with small things, tiny cracks in the foundation that you ignore until the whole house comes crashing down. For me, it started 2 years earlier, during my first Thanksgiving with Caleb's family. I remember the feeling of walking into their Georgetown brownstone for the first time. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like a museum. The air was still and smelled faintly of lemon polish and old money. Caleb squeezed my hand, but I could feel the nervous sweat on his palm. His parents, Sterling and Genevieve Thorn, greeted us in the foyer. Sterling, a man whose power was worn as casually as his tailored suit, gave me a handshake that was brief and limp, his eyes performing a swift, dismissive scan from my heels to the neckline of the dress I'd saved 2 months' salary to buy. Genevieve was worse. She smiled, a perfect bloodless slash of red lipstick, and air-kissed the space next to my cheek. "Oh," she said, her voice dripping with polished condescension. "An army officer. How patriotic." The way she said patriotic, with a slight, almost imperceptible pause, made it sound like a charming but unfortunate condition, like a limp. Dinner was a masterclass in subtle humiliation. The long mahogany table was set with silverware I didn't know how to use, and the turkey, while presented flawlessly, was tragically dry. It was a perfect metaphor for the Thorns themselves, beautiful on the outside, hollow and tasteless within. They didn't ask about my career, my deployments, or what it meant to lead soldiers. The questions were surgical, designed to excavate my pedigree, or lack thereof. "And what does your father do, dear?" Genevieve asked, taking a delicate sip of her expensive red wine. "He's a carpenter," I said, a swell of pride in my chest. "He builds custom furniture." Sterling let out a small, almost inaudible huff of air through his nose and took a moment to dab his lips with a linen napkin. He then looked at me, a tiny smirk playing on his lips. "Honest work," he pronounced, as if delivering a verdict. "How very admirable." I was so naive then, so eager to be accepted, that I actually thought it was a compliment. I didn't understand that in their world, honest work was a euphemism for blue collar, and admirable was what you called something you would never, ever want for your own son. The little cuts kept coming. When Caleb and I got engaged, my parents gave us the most precious gift they could offer. It was a dining room set, hand-built by my father from solid oak. It had taken him 6 months. I remember the smell of sawdust in his workshop, the sight of his calloused, gentle hands sanding the wood until it was as smooth as silk. He had even carved our initials, M and C, inside a small heart on the underside of the tabletop. When we brought it to the Thorns' house to show them, Genevieve looked at it the way one might look at a pile of firewood. "How charming," she'd said, her eyes not quite focusing on it. "We can certainly store it in the basement. It might be useful for extra seating during a garden party." I felt the blood rush to my face. I looked at Caleb, expecting him to defend this piece of my father's heart, this monument to love and labor. Instead, he leaned in and whispered, his voice placating, "Mom just wants what's best for us, honey. You know, for our main house." That night, I cried silently into my pillow. When I called my dad to tell him, his voice was soft and steady on the other end. "It's okay, sweetheart," he said, though I could hear the hurt underneath. "As long as you're happy." My happiness, I was learning, was conditional on the Thorns' approval. The final red flag, the one I willfully ignored, came when I got my re-enlistment bonus. It was a significant amount of money, earned from committing to more years of service, more time away from home. I was proud of it. I told Caleb my plan. We could finally afford a down payment on a house in the Virginia suburbs, close enough to my base, with a crucial feature: a ground floor bedroom for my parents to use whenever they visited. He seemed thrilled at first. But after a 20-minute phone call with his parents, his entire demeanor shifted. He couldn't look me in the eye. "Molly," he said, fidgeting with his watch, "about the house fund. Do you think we could just tell everyone we're splitting it 50-50? You know, my parents are sensitive about these things. I wouldn't want my father to think I can't provide for my own family." He was asking me to lie, to diminish my contribution, to hide my success, all to soothe his father's ego. I was a soldier, trained in honor and integrity. But I was also a woman in love, desperate to keep the peace. So, like a loyal soldier following a questionable order, I agreed. I didn't realize I had just willingly demoted myself in my own life, surrendering command of the very fortress I was about to build. Looking back, the warning signs were all there, blinking like neon lights in a fog. I remember meeting Caleb's sister, Beatrice, at a family Christmas party. She was the family's resident black sheep, a painter who lived in a cramped New York apartment and radiated a kind of weary defiance. After her third glass of wine, she cornered me by the fireplace. She looked me up and down, not with judgment, but with a strange kind of pity. "You're brave, marrying into this family," she'd said, a wry smile on her face. "My advice? Never ever let them have a key to your house." I laughed it off, thinking she was just being dramatic. I thought, our family will be different. Caleb and I are a team. I was wrong. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't an exaggeration. It was a prophecy, one I was too foolish and too in love to heed. A prophecy of the war that was about to begin, not in some foreign desert, but right on my own front porch. The prophecy Beatrice had given me came true on a crisp October evening. I was driving home from a late briefing at the base, my heart light with anticipation. Tonight was our housewarming. I had pictured it 100 times. A small, cozy gathering with a few friends from my unit, my parents, maybe even Beatrice, if she could make it down from New York. I'd bought apple cider from a local farm, and the whole house smelled of the cinnamon potpourri my mom had taught me how to make. It was supposed to be a celebration of our new beginning. But what greeted me was not a beginning. It was an invasion. The first sign was the line of expensive cars parked down our quiet suburban street. The second was the gleaming white van from an elite DC catering company parked in my driveway. My stomach clenched. I walked through the front door I'd left unlocked, and the scene inside stopped my breath. My home was gone. In its place was a sterile, elegant cocktail party. Smooth jazz drifted from hidden speakers. Strangers in silk dresses and dark suits held champagne flutes, laughing in hushed, important tones. And in the center of it all, like a general commanding her troops, was Genevieve. She was wearing a shimmering silver cocktail dress, directing uniformed staff who were systematically replacing my simple bouquets of daisies from the farmer's market with towering, soulless arrangements of white orchids. My cinnamon potpourri was gone, replaced by the scent of expensive perfume. She saw me and glided over, air-kissing me again. "Molly, darling, I decided your little party needed a bit of an upgrade. I hope you don't mind." She didn't wait for an answer. Beside her, Caleb stood holding a glass of champagne, a weak smile plastered on his face. He nodded at me, but his eyes darted away, seeking out the powerful guests his mother had invited. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking past me, at them, the people who were walking through my house as if they already owned it. I became a ghost at my own party, a waitress without a uniform. I floated through the rooms, my mind numb with shock. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, not champagne, and as I reached for the ice tray, I overheard Genevieve's voice from the living room, sharp and clear. "That ground floor room," she was saying to a woman dripping in diamonds, "Sterling is going to turn it into a magnificent library. It will be perfect for entertaining his more important clients." The ice tray slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. My blood ran cold. That's my father's room. The room I had planned for him. The whole reason we bought this specific house. My shock solidified into a hard, cold knot of anger. I stormed out of the kitchen and found Caleb deep in conversation with a... I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into his expensive suit jacket. "Caleb," I hissed, my voice low and urgent. "Your mother is planning to turn my father's room into a library." He frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at being interrupted. He gently pried my fingers off his arm. "Molly, don't be so sensitive," he murmured, his eyes flicking back to the lawyer. "It's just an idea. This isn't the time. You're embarrassing me." He turned his back on me, seamlessly resuming his conversation, leaving me standing alone in the middle of a crowded room that had, moments before, been my living room. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick with their laughter, their perfume, their entitlement. I had to get out. I decided to go get my parents. Their presence, their simple, honest goodness would make this place feel like mine again. It would anchor me. When we returned, the invasion had escalated into a full-blown occupation. A valet in a red vest stopped my car at the end of the street. "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said politely. "This area is reserved for the event." I had to park nearly 2 blocks away. The October wind was sharp, cutting through my mom's thin cardigan. I put my arm around her and took my father's other arm, helping him walk the distance, his breathing already sounding a little ragged in the cold air. We finally reached the front door. I pulled out my key, the key to my home. It slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. My heart hammered against my ribs. They had changed the lock. Panic seized me. I started banging on the door, my fist thudding against the solid wood. "Caleb, let us in." The smooth jazz from inside faltered for a second. The door remained closed. Then, a face appeared in the paned glass window beside the door. It was Genevieve. She saw us. There was no mistaking it. She saw my mother shivering, my father clutching his chest, his face pale under the porch light. She saw the desperation in my eyes. There was no flicker of concern, no hint of compassion. Her face was a mask of cold indifference. She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug, and then she mouthed 2 words through the glass that killed the last dying ember of hope I had for this family. "We're busy." Desperation turned into a soldier's instinct. My mind went into mission mode. Assess the threat, secure your personnel. Then, act. The threat was clear. My personnel were in danger. I needed to act. I ran around the side of the house, my heels sinking into the soft grass, my eyes scanning for a point of entry. A basement window, left slightly ajar. I wrenched it open, hoisted myself up, and squeezed through the narrow opening, tumbling onto the cold concrete floor below. I scrambled up the stairs, my rage a hot fire in my chest. I burst into the living room to a surreal scene. Caleb was laughing, a loud, hearty laugh, at a joke Sterling had just told. He was completely oblivious, cocooned in his world of privilege while my parents were freezing on his doorstep. I didn't hesitate. I lunged for the front door, tore it open, and yelled, "Dad! Mom!" But it was too late. The sudden blast of warm air, the shock of the door flying open, was too much for my father's already stressed body. He staggered forward, his eyes wide with confusion, and then he collapsed, right on the threshold of the home I had built for him. Time seemed to stop. The jazz music, the laughter, it all faded into a deafening roar in my ears. As I dropped to my knees beside my father, screaming his name and fumbling for my phone to call 911, the first words out of Sterling Thorns' mouth were not, "Is he okay?" No. He turned to the valet captain and said in a voice of pure, irritated convenience, "Get someone to move these cars so the ambulance can get through. This looks terrible." The chaos of the siren faded into the sterile silence of the Inova Fairfax cardiac care waiting room. Time warped in that place. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes into hours. The only sounds were the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum, the distant, muffled pages over the intercom, and the relentless, steady beep of a heart monitor from a room down the hall. The air smelled sharply of antiseptic, a scent that seemed to scrub away all hope. I sat there, numb, my uniform still smelling of grass from where I'd crawled through the yard. I was a captain, trained to command, to act, to solve. But in that chair, I was just a daughter, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like ice in my veins. My phone buzzed, a harsh intrusion into the silence. It was Caleb. For a split second, a foolish, desperate part of me hoped for an apology. For a shred of remorse, I answered, my voice a dry whisper. Hello? His voice came through the line, not soft with concern, but tight with fury. Molly, what the hell are you doing? You ruined the entire evening. My mother is mortified. Did your parents really have to be so dramatic? And just like that, the ice in my veins shattered. The grief, the fear, it all flash froze into something hard and sharp. Rage. Every last illusion I had about the man I married, about the life we were supposed to build, crumbled into dust. The soldier took over. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My voice dropped into the calm, authoritative tone I use on the battlefield, the one that leaves no room for negotiation. Do not be in my house when I get back, I said, each word a perfectly spaced, ice-cold bullet. That is a direct order. I hung up before he could utter another syllable. The war had been declared. Hours later, a doctor in blue scrubs finally came out. He looked exhausted, but his eyes were kind. Your father is a fighter, he said. He's stable. The next 24 hours are critical, but he's through the worst of it. A wave of relief so intense it nearly buckled my knees washed over me. After settling my mother into the chair by Dad's bedside, I walked out of the hospital and into the cold night. There was only one place to go. I drove straight to Arlington, to the apartment of my best friend, Jasmine Jazz Carter. We'd served together, and she'd left the army to become a powerhouse lawyer. She opened her door, took one look at my disheveled uniform and the raw grief on my face, and did what only a true friend would do. She said nothing. She just pulled me into a fierce, bone-crushing hug that told me I wasn't alone. Inside, she sat me down on her couch, wrapped a thick wool blanket around my shoulders, and pressed a steaming mug of tea into my hands. She sat across from me and just waited. And then the story poured out of me, the party, the library, the locked door, my father's collapse, Caleb's phone call. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in a torrent of pain and anger. Jazz listened, her expression growing harder, colder, more focused with every detail. When I was finished, she didn't offer empty platitudes like, "It'll be okay." Jazz wasn't that kind of friend. She was the kind of friend who helped you fight back. Her eyes, sharp and intelligent, met mine. They broke the law, Molly, she said, her voice firm. Changing the locks on a marital property without your consent constitutes illegal dispossession, and knowingly leaving an elderly man with a heart condition out in the cold could be grounds for a reckless endangerment charge. This isn't just a family dispute. This is actionable. Hearing her put legal terms to their cruelty was like a switch flipping in my brain. The chaos of my emotions began to organize itself. The hurt was still there, but now it had a purpose. My inner commander, the one who had been dormant, was starting to wake up. Okay, I said, my voice steadier. What's the first move? Intel, Jazz replied instantly. We need evidence. Start with the money. Following her lead, I pulled out my phone and opened our joint banking app. My breath caught in my throat. A single, massive withdrawal 3 days ago. $40,000. My re-enlistment bonus. Gone. As I scrolled down, I saw the corresponding charge, a $22,000 payment to Thorns Elite Catering and Events. The lie was staring at me in black and white. Caleb hadn't just gone along with the party, he'd actively funded their invasion using my money I earned by pledging years of my life to serving our country. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a premeditated operation. I methodically took screenshots of every transaction. Each tap of my finger felt like me loading a round into a magazine. As I was sending the files to Jazz, an unknown number flashed on my screen. I hesitated, then answered. Hello? Molly, it's Beatrice. Caleb's sister, her voice was trembling. I'm so sorry, I saw everything. I had to call. She took a shaky breath. They did the same thing to me when I bought my first apartment in New York. They flew in, redecorated, and tried to install their old housekeeper to look after me. It's how they operate. It's how they maintain control. They will not stop. Her confession was the final, crucial piece of intelligence. This wasn't personal. It was procedural. It was their playbook for hostile takeovers. "Thank you, Beatrice," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "You have no idea how much this helps." When I hung up, I looked at Jazz. The heartbroken woman who had walked into this apartment an hour ago was gone. In her place sat a captain, clear-eyed and resolute. The grief had been burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard steel of purpose. My personal feelings were irrelevant now. This was a mission. If you've ever had your kindness mistaken for weakness, please support me by hitting that like button. And let me know in the comments, just type, Team Molly, if you're with me on this fight. Knowing I'm not alone means the world. I took a deep, steadying breath and met Jazz's gaze. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath the surface, but it was no longer in command. I was. "Okay, Jazz," I said, my voice devoid of any tremor. "Brief me. What's our plan of attack?" I left Jazz's apartment before sunrise, the adrenaline from our late-night strategy session replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. The battle plan was set, but the soldier was running on empty. I drove to the hospital, the quiet hum of the engine the only sound in the pre-dawn stillness. I found my mother asleep in the stiff, unforgiving visitor's chair, her head slumped at an uncomfortable angle, her hand still loosely holding my father's. She looked so small, so fragile. I gently woke her and convinced her to let me take her home to rest. After a quiet word with the nurse confirmed my dad was holding steady, I walked out into the pale morning light. And I was adrift. I couldn't go back to Jazz's. I couldn't face the questions in her sharp, kind eyes right now. And I certainly couldn't go back to that house. It was no longer my home. It was enemy territory, a place I had to strategize to reclaim. So I just drove. I drove aimlessly through the winding roads of suburban Virginia, the neat houses and manicured lawns a blur outside my window. I was a captain in the United States Army, a commander of soldiers responsible for millions of dollars of equipment. But in that moment, I felt like a lost child, unmoored and utterly alone, with no safe harbor to turn to. My mind was blank, except for one faint, beckoning light. The memory of a little roadside diner my dad and I used to go to on Saturday mornings. Rosie's Diner looked exactly the same, a comforting constant in a world that had just been turned upside down. The familiar scent of brewing coffee and frying bacon wrapped around me like a warm blanket as I slid into a booth in the corner, hoping to be invisible. But you're never invisible at Rosie's. Rosie herself, a woman in her 60s with a magnificent crown of silver hair and a no-nonsense twinkle in her eye, came over with a coffee pot. She filled my mug, then paused, looking at me closely. "Molly, honey, you don't look so good." I tried to conjure a smile, but it felt brittle, like it might crack. "I'm fine, Rosie, just a long night." She didn't buy it for a second. She set the pot down and placed a warm, firm hand on my shoulder. "You're a terrible liar, soldier girl," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "How's your dad? Last week he was in here bragging about that rose trellis you built for your mom." Her simple, genuine question, the memory of my father's simple pride, was the one thing that could breach my defenses. The armor I had so carefully constructed over the last 12 hours just dissolved. The tears I hadn't allowed myself to shed finally came, hot and silent, rolling down my cheeks and dripping onto the Formica tabletop. I felt a sob catch in my throat. I didn't tell her the whole ugly story. I couldn't. I just managed to choke out that my dad was in the hospital, that there had been an incident at the house. Rosie didn't press for details. She just nodded with a deep, knowing empathy, patted my shoulder one more time, and went back to the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned. She placed a steaming, oversized bowl in front of me, the rich aroma of chicken and herbs rising to meet me. It was her famous chicken noodle soup, thick with vegetables and homemade noodles. Beside it was a fluffy golden brown buttermilk biscuit. "Eat," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "It's on the house. Soldiers gotta eat." I picked up the spoon, my hands trembling slightly. The first taste was a perfect blend of savory broth and salt. The salt from the soup and the salt from my tears. It was more than just a meal. It was care. It was nourishment for a soul that had been starved of kindness. It was recognition. In a world where my husband's family saw me as an obstacle, a problem to be managed, this woman, a near stranger, saw me for what I was: a soldier in pain, a daughter in fear. And she offered grace, no questions asked. I was reminded of the stories of the Cajun Navy during Hurricane Katrina, of ordinary people in their fishing boats, heading into the storm, not because they were ordered to, but because it was the right thing to do. In the darkest moments, it's the good. As I was slowly working my way through the soup, feeling its warmth spread through me, a man a few stools down at the counter turned around. He was older, with a weathered face and kind eyes, wearing a faded green baseball cap with the Marine Corps globe and anchor emblem on it. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice a gravelly baritone. "I overheard Rosie say your father was a Vietnam man." I nodded, wiping my eyes with a napkin. "Yes, sir. Army." He gave a slow, respectful nod. "You give that brother my regards. And here." He pulled a worn leather wallet from his back pocket and laid a crisp $20 bill on the counter beside my bowl. "Buy him a magazine or something at the hospital. We gotta take care of our own." I stared at the $20 bill, then up at his face, and I was speechless. All I could do was whisper, "Thank you." He just touched the brim of his cap. Semper Fi. I sat there, in a humble roadside diner in Virginia, and realized that in the space of an hour, I had been given more genuine warmth, more unconditional support, and more true camaraderie than I had received from the Thorn family in 2 years. They weren't my blood. They weren't connected to me by law or marriage. But they were my people. They were my unit. They were the family you find when the one you thought you had reveals its true colors. I held the warm bowl of soup in my hands, a small anchor in the storm, and for the first time since my world fell apart, I didn't feel quite so alone. The warmth from Rosie's diner carried me through the next few days. It was a fragile peace, a temporary truce in a war I knew was far from over. I spent my time shuttling between the hospital and Jazz's apartment, which had become my de facto command center. My father was getting stronger, his color returning, his jokes becoming more frequent, albeit whispered. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope that the Thorns, faced with the severe consequences of their actions, might have finally understood. That hope was obliterated by the arrival of a gift basket. It wasn't just any gift basket. It was a monument to cluelessness, delivered by a courier from Dean and DeLuca, the kind of place Genevieve frequented. The wicker basket was the size of a small suitcase, overflowing with things a man recovering from a heart attack was expressly forbidden to have. A bottle of French Bordeaux, wedges of pungent Swiss cheese, rich Belgian chocolates, and cured Italian salami. My mother stared at it, her brow furrowed in confusion. They don't get it, do they, honey?" she murmured. "Oh, they got it. I understood perfectly. This wasn't a gift. It was a performance. It was a public relations move, a carefully curated display of concern designed not to comfort the sick, but to absolve the guilty." Tucked inside was a card with Genevieve's elegant looping handwriting. "Dearest Arthur, wishing you a swift recovery." The entire evening was just a dreadful misunderstanding. A misunderstanding. The word echoed in the quiet hospital room. They were already rewriting history, reducing their calculated cruelty to a simple social gaffe. My stomach tightened. This was phase 1 of their counteroffensive. Phase 2 came that evening, via a phone call from Caleb. His voice, once tight with anger, was now syrupy sweet, a tone I recognized as his handling mom voice. "Honey," he began, "I'm so worried about your dad. I am so sorry things got so out of hand. Mom feels just terrible. She never meant for any of this to happen." I stayed silent, listening. he continued, his voice oozing with false sincerity. Maybe if you called her, just to let her know you understand, it would go a long way. She was under so much stress organizing everything. She just wanted to impress everyone, for us. I felt the air leave my lungs. He wasn't just making excuses for her, he was recasting the roles. In his version of the story, Genevieve was the victim of stress, and I was the unreasonable one who failed to understand. He was asking me, the daughter whose father they had put in the hospital, to apologize to the architect of the whole disaster. It was a classic gaslighting technique. Twist the narrative until the victim questions their own reality. I felt a cold knot of nausea in my gut. Phase 3 was executed by Sterling himself the next day. He didn't bother with false sweetness. His tone was the one he used in a boardroom: calm, authoritative, and utterly inflexible. "Molly," he said without any preamble, "I think it's time we all started acting like adults. What happened was unfortunate, but your decision to bar Caleb from his own home is an overreaction. That house, legally, you do not have that right." He paused, letting the veiled threat hang in the air between us. "I have no desire for this to become a legal matter. It would be messy for everyone. Let Caleb come home. We will all sit down and discuss this as a family." It was an offer of peace delivered with the chilling finality of an ultimatum. It was the voice of an invader demanding the terms of surrender. He wasn't asking for a conversation. He was informing me of the inevitable outcome. I remembered something from my SEER training: survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. The instructors taught us the psychological tactics used to break down prisoners of war: isolate them, disorient them, manipulate the truth, and alternate between kindness and threats to keep them off balance. The Thorns were running the playbook perfectly. The gift basket was the kindness. Caleb's call was the disorientation. And this call, from Sterling, was the threat. Their goal wasn't reconciliation. It was submission. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a response. I just stayed silent, letting his words evaporate into nothing. I thought, foolishly, that my silence might be a weapon. That if I didn't engage, they would eventually run out of ammunition and retreat. I was wrong. They weren't retreating. They were escalating. The final blow came the next morning. I was sitting by my dad's bed, reading him the sports section of the Washington Post, when my phone vibrated with a new email. The sender wasn't a Thorn. It was from the official domain of Sterling's law firm. The subject line was a cold, legalistic spear thrown directly at my heart. Formal notice regarding access to jointly held marital property. My hands started to shake as I opened it. It was a meticulously drafted letter, full of phrases like unlawful obstruction and fiduciary duty. It stated in no uncertain terms that if I continued to wrongfully prevent Caleb from entering the residence, their firm would be compelled to seek immediate judicial intervention. That was it. The final drop. They had moved beyond social pressure and emotional manipulation. They were now weaponizing the law against me. They were using their power, their money, and their influence to formally, legally, and publicly crush my resistance. They weren't just a toxic family anymore. They were the enemy. I looked from the glowing screen of my phone to my father, who had dozed off, his chest rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. The sight of his vulnerability, of his quiet strength, solidified my resolve. The time for silent resistance was over. The time for strategic retreats was over. They had brought the battle to me, and as any soldier knows, when the enemy is at the gate, you don't wait. You fight back. I was sitting in the hospital Starbucks, the threatening email from Sterling's law firm burning a hole in my phone screen. Each carefully chosen legal term was a brick in the wall they were building around me, trying to box me in. My hand was shaking, a fine tremor that betrayed the rage boiling just beneath my skin. I reached for my coffee, and the cup rattled against the saucer, a dark, bitter wave sloshing over the white ceramic. The smell of burnt espresso filled the air, a perfect match for the acrid taste of injustice in my mouth. As I fumbled with a napkin, my phone buzzed on the table. The caller ID read, Genevieve Thorn. My training told me not to engage with the enemy on their terms. But a colder instinct took over. I needed to hear it. I needed to confirm the full scope of their delusion. I answered. Her voice, slick and sweet as poisoned honey, poured into my ear. Molly, dear, Sterling just told me about the unpleasantness with the lawyers. I simply can't believe you've allowed things to escalate this far. She let out a delicate, theatrical sigh. But because I am the bigger person, I am prepared to forgive your little outburst. I've taken the liberty of making a reservation for the four of us at the inn at Little Washington for Saturday night. We'll get dressed up, have a lovely dinner, and simply forget this whole unfortunate business ever happened. Consider it your opportunity to apologize and make things right. I was frozen, the phone feeling like a block of ice against my cheek. She wasn't sorry. She felt nothing. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a summons. She was offering me a chance to crawl back into their good graces, to be forgiven for the crime of reacting to her own calculated cruelty. It was the most profound, most insulting act of psychological warfare I had ever witnessed. He was awake, sitting up against the pillows, the color finally returning to his face. He took one look at the storm in my eyes, muted the sports channel on the TV, and waited. I told him everything. About the email, about Genevieve's call, about her magnanimous offer of forgiveness. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Molly, he said, his voice holding the steady calm of a man who had seen far worse battles. I heard you on the phone with Caleb the other night. You need to stop trying to protect us. We're fine. It's time to protect yourself. He reached out and took my hand. His was a carpenter's hand, calloused and strong, a hand that had spent a lifetime building things. In a war, he said, his grip firm and grounding, you can't win by only digging trenches. You defend and you defend, but eventually, you run out of morale. There comes a point when you have to stop defending and start returning fire. You have to make the enemy pay a price for every inch of ground they try to take. If you don't, they'll just keep advancing until there's nothing left of you. His words hit me like a splash of cold water. He wasn't just giving me advice, he was giving me a direct order. He was reminding me of my duty, not just as a daughter, but as a soldier. To defend my territory. A line from a Brené Brown talk flashed in my mind. Courage was speaking your truth, even when your voice shakes. In that moment, a clean white-hot flame ignited in my soul, burning away the last vestiges of fear, doubt, and the pathetic hope that this family could ever change. I squeezed my father's hand, stood up, and walked out into the hallway. My shoulders were back. My purpose was absolute. I found Caleb's name in my contacts and pressed the call button without hesitation. He answered on the first ring, his voice buoyed by an infuriating, oblivious optimism. Honey, you got Mom's message, right? The inn. Isn't that fantastic? I cut him off, my voice as flat and cold as a sheet of ice. Caleb, listen very carefully because I am only going to say this once. The silence on his end was immediate. I will not be attending that dinner, I stated, each word precise. I will not be making things right because I am not the one in the wrong. You have 24 hours to remove every single item you own from my house. If your things are not gone by this time tomorrow, I will personally pack them in heavy-duty trash bags and leave them on the curb for collection. He sputtered, a pathetic mix of shock and disbelief. You can't. Molly, that's our house. No, I corrected him, my voice slicing through his protest. It is my house. I paid for 70% of it with a combat re-enlistment bonus. Money I earned by putting my life on the line in Afghanistan while you were sitting safely in an air-conditioned office in D.C. You asked me to lie about that to protect your fragile ego, and like a fool, I agreed. But that is over. All of it, this marriage, my patience, my silence, it is all over. I heard a frantic scrambling sound, a muffled, "Give me that phone," and then Genevieve's sharp, screeching voice erupted in my ear. You insolent little girl, you have no idea who you're talking to. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a genuine smile touched my lips. It was a cold, bitter smile. The smile of a soldier who has just accepted the terms of engagement. If you have ever had to draw a hard line in the sand to protect your peace, please hit that like button to stand with me. And in the comments, just write one word: boundaries. Let's fill the comments with that word as a reminder of our strength. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm talking to, Mrs. Thorne," I said, my voice now dangerously calm. "And you, and your husband, and your son are all about to find out exactly who you've been messing with." I didn't wait for her to shriek back. I didn't give her another second of my time. I pressed the red icon on my screen, ending the call and ending an entire chapter of my life. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with a terrifying, exhilarating clarity. The real battle had just begun. After ending the call with Genevieve, I didn't waste a second. The emotional storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, clear battlefield. I drove straight from the hospital to Jazz's office on K Street in D.C. This wasn't a social call, it was a deployment. Jazz's office wasn't what you'd expect from a high-powered lawyer. There were no mahogany desks or stuffy leather chairs. It was sparse, clean, and ruthlessly organized, every file squared away with military precision. A single, powerful, abstract painting hung on the wall, a splash of defiant color in an otherwise monochromatic space. It was an office designed for one purpose: to win. We stood over her large conference table, the polished surface reflecting our determined faces. "All right, Captain," Jazz said, her voice all business. "Give me a full situation report." I began to lay out the evidence methodically, applying the principles of the military decision-making process I knew by heart. Step 1. Receipt of mission. My mission was to secure my territory and neutralize the threat. Step 2. Mission analysis. I presented Jazz with the key facts. First, the financial front, I said, pulling up the bank statements on my tablet. Proof of my 70% down payment via my re-enlistment bonus. The subsequent $40,000 withdrawal by Caleb. The $22,000 payment to Thorn Elite Catering. I swiped to the next file. Second, communications. The email from Caleb asking me to lie about the 50-50 split. The threatening email from Sterling's law firm. With each piece of evidence I presented, Jazz would take the file, slip it into a clear plastic sleeve, and place it into a neatly labeled binder. Financials, correspondence, intent. The large table was no longer a piece of furniture. It was our war map. My chaotic pain was being transformed into an organized, actionable intelligence portfolio. "Good," Jazz said, her focus absolute. "We have motive and we have a paper trail. Now we secure the asset." She looked at me. "First things first, Captain. We retake your base of operations." Her efficiency was breathtaking. She got on the phone, her voice calm and authoritative. "First, to a 24/7 locksmith and security firm. I need a team dispatched immediately to a residence in Fairfax County. Full lock replacement, all exterior doors, and a quote on a 4-camera security system, installation ASAP." She listened for a moment. "Yes, the owner is with me. She has evidence of unlawful entry and has reason to fear for her safety." Next, she dialed the non-emergency line for the Fairfax County Police Department. "Yes, I'm an attorney representing Captain Molly Ball. We will have a locksmith on site at her residence in approximately 1 hour. Given the contentious nature of the situation with her estranged husband, we are requesting a patrol car be present to keep the peace. No, we don't anticipate violence, but we are taking every precaution." Jazz's decisive actions cut through my lingering fear. She wasn't just offering advice, she was executing a plan, turning my abstract desire for justice into a concrete checklist of tasks. The mission was underway. An hour later, I was standing on my own driveway, a police cruiser parked discreetly at the curb. It was a surreal feeling, needing a police escort to enter my own home. The locksmith, a quiet, efficient man, had the old, compromised locks drilled out in minutes. As he worked, I stepped inside. The house was a mess, littered with the aftermath of the party: abandoned champagne flutes, crumpled napkins, the faint, cloying scent of stale perfume. My first instinct was to start cleaning, to erase the violation. But then my training kicked in. I wasn't here to clean. I was conducting a damage assessment. I took out my phone and began to document everything, my movements precise and methodical. I photographed the lingering evidence of their occupation. A silk scarf belonging to Genevieve draped over a chair in the guest room. Her expensive jewelry box left open on the vanity. They had intended to stay. Then, in the ground floor room, my father's room, I saw it. On the desk that Sterling had clearly claimed as his own, amidst a stack of his legal papers, was a single sheet of paper. It was a partially filled out USPS change of address form. The names listed were Sterling and Genevieve Thorn. The old address was their place in Georgetown. The new address was mine. I felt a jolt, a surge of cold, triumphant electricity. This was it, the smoking gun. This wasn't just circumstantial evidence anymore. This was concrete proof of their premeditated plan to permanently dispossess me. I took a dozen photos of that form from every conceivable angle. I returned to K Street feeling like I had just successfully completed a covert reconnaissance mission. I uploaded the photos to Jazz's secure server. When the image of the change of address form appeared on the large monitor in her office, her eyes lit up with the predatory gleam of a lawyer who knows she has an airtight case. "Checkmate," she whispered, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across her face. "This is proof of intent. Calculated, premeditated intent to commit fraud." She picked up her phone. "It's time to send the invitations to the parley. We'll summon them here, to our ground. They'll think they're coming for a negotiation. They have no idea they're walking into a court-martial." She paused, her finger hovering over the screen, that mysterious smile returning. "And I just got a confirmation email," she said, looking up at me, her eyes sparkling. "It seems Beatrice Thorne would also like to attend this meeting. She says she has some family documents she'd like to share." A witness, from inside the enemy camp. All the pieces were now in place on the board. All that was left was to spring the trap. The day of the meeting, I dressed with the same care I would for a formal military inspection. My uniform was perfectly pressed, my hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. I wasn't dressing as Molly, the wounded wife. I was presenting myself as Captain Ball, an officer prepared for a tribunal. I felt a strange calm settle over me. I wasn't nervous. I was ready. Jazz's conference room was enclosed in floor-to-ceiling glass, a transparent box in the heart of K Street. It offered no corners to hide in, no shadows to obscure the truth. The Thorns, who thrived on backroom deals and whispered insinuations, were about to be put on display under the full, unforgiving glare of the light. They arrived precisely on time, sweeping in with the unshakable arrogance of people who have never lost a fight. Sterling was immaculate in a dark, pinstriped suit that probably cost more than my car. Genevieve wore a cream-colored dress, a vibrant Hermes scarf knotted artfully at her throat, a shield of manufactured elegance. Caleb trailed behind them, looking pale and anxious, a ghost haunting his own parents' power play. He wouldn't meet my eyes. They sat down opposite Jazz and me. Sterling placed his expensive leather briefcase on the table with a soft, authoritative thud and immediately took charge. "All right, Ms. Carter," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm glad we could all gather. I hope we can resolve Molly's little outburst, quickly and discreetly. We are prepared to be generous." Jazz didn't flinch. She simply raised a hand, a quiet, simple gesture that somehow silenced him instantly. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice polite but edged with steel, "thank you for coming. But today you will not be speaking, you will be listening." The shift in power was immediate and absolute. Sterling's mouth opened, then closed. He looked, for the first time since I had met him, utterly wrong-footed. I stood up. I didn't look at Caleb. I didn't look at Genevieve. I looked directly at Sterling, the head of the snake. I held a remote in my hand and clicked it. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life. "This is an after-action report," I said, my voice steady, devoid of emotion, the same tone I would use to brief a commanding general. On the 15th of October, at approximately 1900 hours, an unauthorized occupation of my private residence occurred. This action directly resulted in a medical emergency involving Mr. Arthur Ball. a 72-year-old Vietnam veteran with a documented history of cardiac illness, who was hospitalized for distress and exposure. Click. The screen showed the $22,000 invoice from Thorn Elite Catering. Click. The bank statement showing the $40,000 withdrawal from our joint account 3 days prior. Click. The invoice from the locksmith for the emergency lock replacement. With each slide, I could feel the atmosphere in the glass room growing colder, tighter. I saved the best for last. Click. A high-resolution close-up photograph of the USPS change of address form, with their names, their Georgetown address, and my Virginia address clearly visible. This was not a misunderstanding, I concluded, turning to face them fully. This was a calculated, premeditated campaign to illegally seize control of a shared asset. This was an act of deliberate, malicious aggression. Genevieve let out a short, sharp laugh, though it sounded brittle. This is absurd. A few misplaced papers. Sterling, recovering his composure, adopted a dismissive tone. This is all circumstantial conjecture, Ms. Carter. You have nothing. On the contrary, Jazz's voice cut in, smooth as silk. The conference room door opened and Beatrice Thorn walked in. She looked terrified, but resolute. She was holding a tablet computer. It's not conjecture, Dad, she said, her voice shaking but clear. She walked to the table and handed the tablet to Jazz, avoiding the stunned, horrified gazes of her parents. Jazz connected the tablet to the monitor. An email thread appeared on the screen, sent between Sterling and Genevieve Thorn. Their strategy, in their own words, was laid. We read their discussion on how to psychologically wear Molly down, how to leverage Caleb's loyalty, and how to convince me to sell my share of the house at a loss after they had successfully established residency. And then came the final damning line, written by Genevieve herself. The little soldier girl is stubborn. We need to show her, once and for all, who is in command here. A dead, suffocating silence fell over the room. The color drained from Sterling's face. Genevieve looked as if she'd been slapped, her hand flying to her Hermes scarf as if to ward off an attack. Caleb stared at the screen, then at his parents, and the look on his face was one of dawning, gut-wrenching horror. He looked at them as if seeing them for the very first time. He made a small choked sound, and then he dropped his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. Jazz stood up, the picture of cold, professional fury. You have two options, she said, her voice like ice. Option 1, my office files a civil suit for financial malfeasance, reckless endangerment, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Concurrently, we will forward this entire evidence package to the Washington Post. Your reputation, Mr. Thorn, both professionally and socially, will be annihilated. She let that sink in for a long, painful moment. Option 2, she continued. You accept the terms of surrender offered by Captain Ball. I stood up then, the full weight of my authority settling on me like a mantle. I looked at the three broken people across the table. I was Lady Justice, but my eyes were wide open. You will reimburse the full $62,000 to my personal account. You will cover every cent of my father's medical bills, past, present, and future. And the three of you will sign a legally binding agreement never to contact me or my parents or set foot on my property again, ever. I paused. This is over. After the Thorns scurried out of Jazz's office, their arrogance shattered, there was no triumphant celebration. There was only silence. A vast, echoing silence that followed me all the way home. I walked through my front door, the new locks clicking shut behind me with a reassuring finality. The house was clean, quiet, and for the first time, it felt completely, unequivocally mine. But there was no joy in the victory. Only a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound, cavernous emptiness. The adrenaline of the fight had vanished, leaving behind the stark reality of the aftermath. I had won the war, yes. I had defended my territory, repelled the invaders. But the cost had been immense. The life I thought I was building, the marriage I had invested my heart in, the hope for a blended family. It was all wreckage, collateral damage. I found myself in the ground floor room, the one meant for my father. I sat on the floor, my back against the cool drywall, and stared out the window at the garden. I had successfully defended the fortress, but now I was the lone sentry on the wall, guarding a kingdom of one. Victory, I was learning, had a bitter, lonely taste. A few weeks passed in a blur of hospital visits and quiet nights alone. The money was wired to my account. The agreement was signed. It was all clinically, legally, finished. Then a text from Caleb. "Can we talk? Just once, please." We met at a neutral location, a sterile coffee shop and a strip mall halfway between my house and his new apartment. He looked diminished, thinner, tired, and without the imposing figures of his parents flanking him, he looked startlingly like a lost boy. He nervously stirred his coffee, the clinking of the spoon against the ceramic, the only sound between us for a long moment. "Molly," he began, his voice raspy, "I've started seeing a therapist. I'm realizing a lot of things. About them, about me. About how I let them run my entire life." He finally looked up, and his eyes were filled with a genuine, painful remorse. "I failed you. As a husband, as a partner, as a man. I am so, so sorry." The apology was real. I could see that. A younger version of me, the one who had so desperately wanted his love to be enough, would have clung to those words. But I had heard too many words. I had seen too many actions that contradicted them. "I hear you, Caleb," I said, my voice gentle, but firm. "But an apology can't erase what happened. You didn't just stand by while they attacked my family. You handed them the ammunition. You used my money to fund their party. You left my father to collapse on the doorstep. Words can't fix that." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table, a picture of desperation. "But I can change. I'm changing. We can start over." I looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for the man I thought I had married. But he was gone, or perhaps he had never really been there at all. I only saw the shell of a man, hollowed out by a lifetime of placating his parents. There was nothing left to build on. "No, Caleb," I said, and the word, when it finally came, felt like a release. "We can't. We ended the night you chose them over me, the night you let my father fall." I reached into my bag and slid a manila folder across the table. Jazz had prepared it for me. "This is an uncontested divorce petition. I'm not asking for a single dime that isn't already mine. I want this to be clean and quick." I took a breath. "But the boundaries are now set in stone. You and your family are to stay away from me and mine. Permanently." He didn't argue. He just stared at the folder as if it were a death certificate. He nodded slowly, the fight gone out of him. The lost boy was truly lost now. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, haunted by one recurring, punishing question. Why did I let it go on for so long? The guilt was a heavy weight on my chest. I blamed myself for ignoring the red flags, for being too loyal, too trusting, for believing that love could conquer the fundamental flaws in his character. Sometime after 2 a.m., I got out of bed, unable to bear the confines of the house any longer. I drove into D.C., the city quiet and sleeping. I found myself at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In the cool, silent darkness, I walked along the length of the wall, its polished black granite reflecting the faint light of the moon. I ran my fingers over the cold, carved names of the fallen, thousands upon thousands of them. Men who, like my father, had answered a call and paid a price. I thought about forgiveness. I'd read an article once about the Jewish concept of teshuvah, or atonement. It argued that true forgiveness couldn't be granted until the person who did the harm had completed 4 steps: verbally confessing their wrongdoing, expressing genuine remorse, compensating for the damage, and proving by their future actions that they would never repeat the offense. Caleb had managed step 1 and maybe step 2. But the Thorns had done none, and I realized that forgiving them wasn't my job. My job was to heal. And that started with forgiving myself. I had acted out of love, loyalty, and hope, the very qualities that make a good soldier, a good partner, a good person. They were the ones who had twisted those qualities and used them as weapons against me. The fault was not mine. Accepting that truth was the final, quiet act of liberation. Standing there, in the presence of so much sacrifice, my own battle felt small, but also valid. I was no longer a victim of the Thorns. I was a survivor of the war they had started. And now, for the first time, the future felt like my own. I thought about Caleb, hoping his therapy would help him. But as I walked away from that wall of names, a new question began to form in my mind, one without an easy answer. Can people truly change? Or do they just become better versions of who they always were? A year has passed since the day in the glass conference room. The question I asked myself that night at the memorial, can people truly change, still lingers. I may never know the answer for Caleb, but I know the answer for me. I have. My house is no longer a fortress. It's a home. A real one, filled not with the tense silence of a fragile truce, but with the easy sounds of life. The gentle murmur of the television, the scent of my mom's baking, and the sound of laughter. My parents moved in with me 6 months ago. My father's health has improved remarkably. The doctors call it a medical marvel. I call it the healing power of peace. Every morning, he sits on the back porch with his coffee, watching me work in my garden. I tore up most of the pristine, manicured lawn in the backyard, that symbol of suburban conformity, and replaced it with raised beds bursting with life. Tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchini, and rows of fragrant lavender. My hands, once trained to expertly handle a rifle and manage complex logistical documents, have become reacquainted with the simple, honest feeling of cool earth and the delicate stems of new seedlings. Every time I pull a stubborn weed from the soil, I feel a quiet satisfaction, as if I'm removing one more remnant of the toxic past. This space is no longer a defensive position. It's a sanctuary. I rarely think about the Thorns. DC is a city that runs on reputation, and theirs, I learned, didn't. Rumors in the elite circles of Georgetown and Capitol Hill are more effective than any lawsuit. The story of a powerful lawyer and his socialite wife mistreating a decorated veteran and his active duty daughter in a city that worships its military was a social death sentence. They committed the one unforgivable sin in Washington. They looked bad. They became toxic. The divorce was finalized without a fight. The last I heard from a quiet text from Beatrice was that Caleb had moved to a different city on the West Coast. He was trying, she said, to build a life on his own terms, away from the long, dark shadow of his parents. I felt no satisfaction at this news, no bitter taste of revenge, only a quiet, detached sense of peace. Their fate was the natural consequence of their own actions. I had simply stepped out of the path of their self-destruction. That nagging question about change found its answer not in them, but in me. My war with the Thorns changed my mission in life. On the base, I noticed the same subtle signs of distress in the spouses of other soldiers, the quiet anxieties, the stories of difficult in-laws, the struggle to maintain a sense of self in a life defined by someone else's career. I saw my own story reflected in their eyes, so I started something. It wasn't an official program, just an informal workshop I held in the community center on Tuesday nights. I called it Operation Boundaries. Using my own hard-won experience as a case study, I created a new kind of training manual. I taught them how to identify the subtle tactics of manipulation, how to establish and enforce healthy boundaries with their families, both the ones they were born into and the ones they married into. Most importantly, I taught them how to defend their own mental and emotional territory, how to build a sanctuary inside themselves that no one could invade. I took the most painful chapter of my life and turned it into a map to help others find their way out of the woods. My pain had become my purpose. My scars had become my credentials. Last night, the three of us, my mom, my dad, and I, were sitting down to dinner on the back porch. We were eating a simple meal made almost entirely from my garden: fresh tomato salad, grilled zucchini, a side of new potatoes. The sun was setting, painting the Virginia sky in brilliant shades of purple and orange. My dad reached across the table and took my hand. His grip was strong again. "I'm proud of you, Molly," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I thought he was going to say something about the battle I'd fought, the victory I'd won. But he didn't. "I'm not proud because you won," he said, looking me straight in the eye. "I'm proud because you found peace after the war." And in that moment, I understood everything. I looked out at the peaceful sky, at the garden I had cultivated with my own 2 hands, at the faces of the 2 people who represented unconditional love. I finally realized that the hardest battles aren't fought on distant fields of fire. They are fought in our hearts and in our homes. And the greatest victory isn't in defeating an enemy. It's in building a life where you can finally breathe freely, surrounded by a love that is true and a peace that is earned. My name is Captain Molly Ball. I survived the war with the Thorns. And this is the story of how I reclaimed not just my house, but my own soul. Thank you for listening to my story. My specific battle is over, but I know that for many of you watching, the fight for your own peace continues. Please know that your strength is real, your boundaries are valid, and you are not alone on your journey. If this story resonated with you, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe and join our community of survivors. Liking this video helps this message of hope reach others who might need to hear it. And finally, I'd love to read in the comments, what is one small step you are taking to build your own sanctuary of peace?